Hello, and welcome to Gardener's World. In 2020, life was turned upside down. Lots of us were spending much more time at home, and our gardens and outdoor green spaces provided an important source of comfort and well-being. There's no doubt that gardening and a connection to nature are beneficial for our bodies and our minds. And in the second of two special programs, we're going to celebrate this. Look back at the very best of Gardener's World from last year. On today's program, Arit visits the landscape designer Dan Pearson at his own garden in Somerset.
I just see all the undulations of the hillsides and the trees, and actually, if I'm honest, I don't know where your garden starts and finishes.
This is what I wanted to achieve, this quality of the land coming into the garden and the garden stepping into the land.
We revisit the sisters who discovered a shared passion for gardening.
It's so big, it's so amazing, it's growing. Ta-da! Ta-da!
And I've got some top feeding tips to help our garden birds make it through the winter.
Because the more birds you have in the garden, the fewer caterpillars and aphids and slugs and snails you will have. And birds are one of the linchpins of a really healthy garden.
After an exceptionally wet winter, the weather in spring 2020 was wonderful. And at Longmeadow, we basked in a succession of exceptionally sunny, dry days. By June, the shrub roses in the cottage garden were in full bloom. The clematis were putting on a fantastic show. And in the Paradise Garden, my lemon trees were laden with ripe fruit.
Now, a plant that is powering its way here in the Jewel Garden is Crocosmia lucifer. These brilliant vermilion flowers shine out for weeks on end. And when the flowers are over, the seed heads are really decorative and stay looking good well into autumn.
Ever since it was first introduced, Lucifer has been a star in all our gardens. But its parents originate from South Africa, and Nick went there to see them growing in the wild.
A member of the Iridaceae or iris family, the name Crocosmia comes from the Greek word krokos, meaning saffron, and osme, meaning scent, as the dried flowers produce a strong smell of saffron when placed in warm water. There are 9 species of Crocosmia in the world, 7 of which are native to South Africa. And when you see the native plant growing in the wild on a scale like this, you can see why it's become so popular. Here at the Valoran Valley Nature Reserve, the tallest, most vigorous species grow in vast swathes. Perhaps one of our most iconic UK border plants is Crocosmia lucifer. It has those incredible red bird-beak-looking flowers. Well, here is one of its parents. This is Crocosmia paniculata, growing out in the wild. And you can see the sheer scale of it and the fact that these broad bladed leaves carry through to lucifer and give it that real strong characteristic in the garden. What's really lovely about both the parent and lucifer is their incredibly long flowering. And being here and seeing them in the wild can give us real clues as to how to grow them in the UK. Here it's on a relatively free-draining soil, but it gets a lot of rainfall. So during the summer, it needs to be quite damp to keep it flowering well. However, in the winter, it wants to be a bit drier. So you don't want a claggy clay soil. You want something that's a bit free-draining, but with a bit of organic matter, so it holds it well in the summer. And in fact, if you look after it well, you can get about 2 months of flower from it. And then once that's finished, you get the lovely seed pods through the winter. Now, most of us don't have the space to create a swathe of this scale, but by dotting a few through your borders, you can get a really dramatic look at those bright red, lovely flowers. Professor Craig Peter is a botanist at Rhodes University and has a special interest in plant pollination. The cultivar we grow in the UK, Lucifer, is pollinated by a range of different insects. But I understand here there's a real specialist that pollinates these.
Yeah, so if you look at these remarkable long tubular flowers, they accommodate the long curved beak of a malachite sunbird, which is pretty much the exclusive legitimate pollinator.
OK.
So as the bird probes into the flower, the pollen gets deposited up on the forehead of the bird.
Perfect. So the nectar's the reward for it pollinating. I noticed some of the individual flowers are sort of torn apart right at the base of the flower. What's causing that?
Yes, because there is so much nectar in this landscape, lots and lots of other birds are drawn to the area. Not being able to reach the nectar, the only option is to pull the flowers apart.
So this is a landscape of sugar that's feeding all of these different creatures?
It really is. There's a huge amount of energy resources that all sorts of animals, particularly birds, will come to exploit.
Can we eat it?
Of course, nectar is just sugar water. And as I said, these flowers have
literally dripping out.
Huge volumes, and it's really delicious.
Let me have a try. Wow, that's really good. Sort of like a light honey.
Yeah.
Really lovely.
Yeah.
It's just fields of energy.
It's quite a bonanza.
You know, South Africa is full of surprises. You can be walking down a lane and suddenly, kapow! Look at this. This amazing plant is called Brunsvigia, and it's in the Amaryllidaceae family, so it's closely related to those big amaryllis that we grow at Christmas, except it's 10 times the size. What's even more special is these giant paddle leaves it has at the base. They initially appear to be smooth, but if you touch the surface, they're very coarse, which must protect them from being eaten by the native fauna. What an amazing plant. Crocosmia grow in a wide range of habitats in South Africa. A few hours south of Mpumalanga, the open grasslands at the Highveld give way to the rolling hills and mist-belt forests of the Natal Midlands. These indigenous woodlands are home to a host of beautiful South African species, like this little Streptocarpus, just growing away here by the path edge. They're also home to a Crocosmia that thrives in the dappled shade of the woodland canopy. And here it is, Crocosmia aurea, sparkling away on the edge of woodland here. There's a stream down below me, and it's loving these damp conditions. Now, of course, the reason it's called aurea, it's part of the botanical name of the plant, and it means gold, and you can really see that with those stunning tones. What's especially useful about this plant is that it's a parent of most of the cultivars that we grow in the UK. So crossed with Potsii, it's produced some of our most spectacular cultivars. So the likes of Sulphitaire, Emily Mackenzie, and Star of the East are all as a result of this little beauty. Now, it's quite different to Paniculata in terms of its foliage. It's really quite smooth and silky. Comes up to about 60 or 70 centimetres high, and left to its own devices, it'll produce quite a substantial clump in the garden. Now, depending on the cultivar, they can go for up to 3 months of fantastic successions of blooms aloft these lovely silky leaves. But if you want to propagate it or share it, it's just as easy as dealing with any other perennial. So in spring or in autumn, you can use a fork or a spade to cut away a piece with a decent amount of root underneath, and then just plant it up in another part of the garden or share it with friends. We have South Africa to thank for a huge range of the plants that we grow in our gardens. And it's been brilliant to come here and see Crocosmia paniculata and Crocosmia aurea, because of course they're the parents of the very best cultivars we grow in the UK.
Well, this is certainly the Jewel Garden's hour. It is positively bubbling and erupting with rich colour. The sunflowers are out with their shades of yellow through to caramel. There are the oranges of the Tithonias, the flare of flower on the cannas, and those wonderful burgundy banana leaves. Who needs flowers when you have foliage that looks as good as that? And we've got the shocking pink of this phlox that was meant to be magenta, but was the wrong shade. And we've never had the heart to take it out, and it's been flowering like this for 20 years and probably will for another 20 years.
Last year, we wanted to share what you were doing in your gardens. So we asked you to send us short videos, and we were overwhelmed with the response and received some fabulous films, including this one from the dedicated tomato grower, Harry Cortelaris.
Welcome to our garden in Hillingdon in West London. I just thought I'd like to share with you the success I've had with tomatoes this year. So this is how we planted the tomatoes originally. So I've dug a hole, put a piece of string here, and then imagine this is the tomato. It goes in and fill it in. And then we use this string to loop around the plant to the support as it grows. Just keep turning it around until you reach the top of your support here, and then I use pegs to hold it up. I use these plastic cartons to water the roots directly, and when I feed, I just pour the feed directly onto the soil. Also, what I do is let a side shoot come up after the first truss is formed, so I end up with double the amount of tomatoes, which is great. In fact, I love tomatoes so much, I built this pizza oven so we could dry them out. Here's some we prepared earlier. Last year I had the idea that the patio was the sunniest part of our garden, so I built this structure to support some more tomatoes, but we had to put a lot more strings up here with using a lot more pegs. So Veronica, my wife, was really a bit upset with all of the clothes pegs disappearing from her basket.
Now, last summer, Eric visited the garden of the renowned landscape designer Dan Pearson at his home in Somerset.
Dan Pearson has been creating gardens around the world for over 30 years and has received his fair share of accolades and RHS Chelsea awards. He has a reputation for designing naturalistic spaces where the garden sits comfortably within the landscape. But all of Dan's creations are composed so that nature in all of its forms are as much at home as the people it's designed for. You moved out of London to come back to the countryside. What was the drive behind that?
Well, I'm from the country originally in Hampshire, and I'd been living in London, and I'd gardened every single inch of that garden, and I just wanted to feel like I was a much smaller part in a bigger environment.
Right. And I love the fact that as I look out, I just see all the undulations of the hillsides and the trees, and actually, if I'm honest, I don't know where your garden starts and finishes.
This is what I wanted to achieve, so it's great to hear that, because the landscape is the ultimate driver for this. I didn't want it to feel that there was a beginning or an end, because the garden and the landscape are completely interlinked.
Mm-hmm.
And those blurred boundaries for me are really interesting.
Did you find the conditions of this site a challenge or something to really embrace?
Well, both. It's an exposed site. We're windy and we're southwest facing, so it's blazing sunshine when the sun's out.
Right.
First few years I was here was really very much about finding the right plant for the right place here and making sure that I wasn't competing with the environment, so that I was gardening with things that were suitable for here. the little ark of plants that I brought with me from the Peckham Garden, 3 carfuls, sat here on the hill, and they'd had this very easygoing life in London, you know, and they came here and thought, what the hell have you done? And they tell you very quickly that these conditions are different, and you have to work out why, and then how you mitigate for that.
Once he was happy with his plant choices, he could develop the rest of the space, creating terraces which follow the contours of the hillside and wildflower meadows. Here there is a clear context. How can we achieve this in a smaller space?
I think it's just about letting your eye travel and roam a little bit first, and your surroundings, wherever you are, even in an urban situation, are often really interesting. And you can borrow your neighbour's tree. It doesn't have to be yours to contribute to your garden. And the way the aspect of a garden lies, that's going to give you some clues as to how that space should feel, whether it's west-facing and the light comes in the end of the day, or east-facing or the morning. Those things are really informative in terms of how you might then plant the garden.
Okay, there's no excuse then, is what you're saying.
No, exactly. But it's all about just keeping on looking and feeling what it's telling you.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting to hear how Dan has spent so much time experimenting and trialling plants for this site before he even decided where they were going to actually go. And I guess we gardeners can take something from that, that it is okay to experiment and know that sometimes we are going to get things wrong. The key to it is just take time. I absolutely love this section.
The meadows really drive the aesthetic of the garden, so there's a seamlessness between the two. And what I'm doing is emulating the quality of those meadows and also the way they function together. So in here, for instance, I've brought in cultivated plants that feel very much like the things you'll find in the meadows, like this Scabiosa ochroluca, or some of the grasses that you'll find are just rising through here. So there's this quality of the land coming into the garden and the garden stepping into the land. But the other thing that's most important, really, is that all these plants share a liking for the same conditions. And once you choose the plants that are all happy in the same place, then you can start to play with them as a composition. And then I've got other plants which come through in layers amongst these key players, so that you get one thing superseding the next, as you might in a meadow.
This border is alive. I'm seeing so much activity. And again, that's part of those observations of nature, is it?
The biodiversity has just exploded because we're doing something that's improving the environment through gardening it.
And then as I'm looking out, I can see, you know, with the scabious, you know, because it's nice and floaty and bouncy, your eye just can just start to float off.
Travel through it.
Yeah. But things like the self-seeders, how do you manage those?
The self-seeders can really start to take over, so they tend to cut those down just before they seed.
Right.
And I'll sacrifice their winter seed heads.
I like the fact you've got to go in here, Dan. I don't know exactly how you're doing that, but, you know.
You have to maintain a limber quality. Yes.
Looking back at the garden, it's just a gentle haze in the distance. This is a grand-scale garden, but there's something that we can all learn from. First of all, understand the site, get to know the soil, get to know what aspect we're facing. And also, as well, our plants, what we absolutely love, so that we can bring in the right plants for the right place that are going to thrive in our conditions. The final ingredient, patience. If we can learn to slow down and watch the process of growth within our gardens, we will create a truly beautiful space.
I have long believed that nothing contributes more to a healthy, beautiful garden than a really good compost heap. Garden compost is easy enough to make, but there are one or two rules you do need to understand and follow.
The real secret of compost is that it gives life to soil. Because compost is made by material being digested by bacteria and fungi and nematodes and the browning worms and beetles and slugs, and you can make it work like a recipe that you know just works and works every time. So let's look at it like a recipe. First thing, your ingredients. You can add almost anything that's lived to a compost heap, but don't add meat, fats, or cooked material, particularly cooked starches like potato or rice or pasta. And the main reason for that is not that it won't decompose, because it will in time, but it will do so more slowly, but it will attract rodents. You will get rats. But almost everything else from the garden and the house can go on. So for example, kitchen waste, eggshells, banana skin, vegetable parings, all can definitely go on. Typically, the most common compostable material that people have are grass clippings, and that certainly is really important. But that is all green material, very high in nitrogen. And if you just have this sort of waste, what you'll end up with is a sort of green, sludgy slurry. And that's because it's short of oxygen and carbon. Now, carbon comes from brown material. And at this time of year, there's a lot of it. You've got all the dried stems of plants. Straw is archetypal brown material. You can use brown paper. You can use egg boxes. And if you've got cardboard, don't just put it in flat, but rip it up. And you need to mix the green material and the brown material on at least a 50-50 basis. Now, you can just mix them up and it'll work fine. But if you can chop them up or shred them, it'll work much better. And then you end up with this. In the bins, there was steam rising up. Now, that steam is heat generated by the trillions of creatures digesting it. But to work successfully, they need water, so don't let it get too dry, and they need oxygen. So leave it for about 3 or 4 weeks, and then turn it so lots of air can get in there. And if you turn it a couple of times, you get to this point. It's not perfect. There are bits and pieces there that haven't composted at all. It's a bit stuck together. This is fine to use around hedges or shrubs, or to spread on the border in autumn as a mulch, because over winter that will break down and be incorporated into the soil. But if you want to put it onto a vegetable garden in spring or summer, or use it as part of your potting compost, you need to turn it again. And this is how it can become. And what this is doing is adding life to the soil. Essentially, this is a medium for holding bacteria and fungi. And when you put an inch layer over the soil, it's like a starter dome. It recharges the soil, and that extraordinary complex relationship, which I don't begin to understand, between life in the soil and the roots of plants is what makes your garden grow.
If you haven't got a garden, then your plants will all have to be houseplants. But that needn't limit the range or scope of your horticultural imagination.
My name is Joe Bagley, I'm 20 years old and I live with 1,400 houseplants in my 12 by 6 metre apartment. It all started when my grandmother gave me a spider plant cutting when I was 13 years old. My appreciation for nature has pretty much spiralled out of control. I don't have much furniture, so upstairs all I have is a bed and a bedside table. Now in this particular room, it has one of the most amount of plants in, and quite interesting plants too. So at the end here, I've got an Oxalis triangularis. So the crimson purple looking leaves are beautiful, especially the triangular shaped foliage. Now these actually move and they're called nyctinastic responses. So in the day they open up and it looks a little bit like a satellite dish, and at night it will shut and it will form an umbrella type shaped leaf. So the one next door to me here is an asparagus fern, And this, when I first got it, only had a couple of fronds, a couple of leaves, and since then it has just exploded in foliage. Now, at this moment, I've got lots of little new stems. Some of them are about 2 metres. These are pretty easy to look after. You just have to make sure you don't underwater it, because persistent droughts will cause yellow needles. And as soon as the needles turn yellow, they'll start to drop. And that's what one of the most common issues with owners are. So at the bottom here, I've got an umbrella tree. Now these provide a palmaceous, ovular shaped leaves, which can really change the way a room looks, especially because of the contrast and the dark textures of this leaf compared to the white wall, for example. It's a beautiful plant to have in the house, very easy to look after as well, provide a very small amount of direct sun and make sure that the soil's top third dries out in between waters. I've always said that the best way that you can get experience is having the plant yourself and going through trial and error. So what I do is I have this plant, I potentially reduce the temperature or I underwater it slightly just to see how it behaves. And learning about a plant that you physically have is by far the best way that you can learn from indoor gardening. This plant is called Epipremnum pictum agreus and is commonly known as devil's ivy. This particular specimen grows around 40 centimetres a year and requires very little cultivation. I water it once a week just to keep it on the moist side. However, if you do forget, this is also very forgiving. I keep this plant attached to the wall via sticky pad hooks. I don't use nails because I don't want to drill holes in the wall. The longest vine on this specimen is around 6 to 7 metres and it coils itself around the wall and it's actually growing over the wall into the shower now. I see these plants around me as almost like children. Now, of course, most of them don't move, so they grow very slowly. But when you think back and go, actually, from this photo a year ago, or whenever it will be taken, to how it's grown, it does fortify for me how much all of these plants are continually growing, and especially having this many, everything is growing 24/7. You know, how the plants interact with its environment, growing towards the light and producing and investing in new leaves from its energy. I regularly take leaf cuttings because it's quite a fun thing to do. I get the leaf, which is usually around half of the way down from the plant, and that's because it's usually larger with a bit more stored energy. Now I put these leaves on moist soil for about 2 weeks just to kickstart the rooting period off. Now once the roots start to grow and about 1 centimetre in width, I put them into the soil diagonally downwards, and that will get the roots and the new little foliar buds to develop really quickly. Now from a leaf to an actual small specimen, it'll take up to a year for me, but in general it's a very quick and easy process. It's good to be different and live in a different way that normal people do, because living with this many plants, I see this as completely normal. My dream in the future is to have a garden conservatory, and I will use this as an extra lounge, and I'll have metre tall plants with, you know, bulbed fairy lights just to give a lovely, almost a garden atmosphere, but in the comfort of your own home. And not only that, but when it does rain, you will not only be surrounded by low foliage, but you'll also have the pitter-patter of the rain to really reinforce nature at its finest. And for me, the sound of rain beats music any day of the week.
This is the Paradise Garden. And the planting here is based around one dominant plant, a matrix plant, which is a grass called Stipa tenuissima. And this is, if you like, the ground story spread across all 4 borders through which the more dramatic plants grow. And that's the Tulip acuminata in spring, we've had cornflowers, there's Tulbagia. And now, of course, a brilliant display of this fabulous Verbena bonariensis. But the steeper is in a little bit of trouble because steepers of all the grasses like good drainage, and they're perfect for growing on sandy soil or chalk. But on this rich Herefordshire loam, they grow too lush. And then what happens, as the flower heads form, it gets too long and the weight of it topples it over. And not only does that spoil rhythm of the planting, but when it rains, it gets sodden and then suppresses the plants around it. So I simply cut about 3/4 of the way down, pull out with my fingers any of the dead grass, and the idea being that not only will all the plants around them then have more light and air and not be suppressed, but also the grasses will do better. It seems very dramatic, but actually I think it's the best way of treating this particular garden in this particular location. If you live on a much drier site, you probably won't have to cut them back at all.
Even a small garden can have a big effect and be full of surprises, as we found in this garden on the south coast of Devon.
Hi everyone, my name is Dina. This is my courtyard in a little town called Kingsbridge in Devon, and my space is about 2 metres by 4 metres, and I don't have any raised beds or anything. Everything's in pots, so I've had to learn about what works. It's a really small space and you just need to make the most of the space you've got. A really good thing for courtyards is to have big plants, tall plants, big leafed plants. I'm trying to have things that go up as high as they can, but also mix it with leaves that look a little bit more tropical and bigger. So I've got hostas. I've also got a lot of pleasure out of my foxgloves, which go up really high. And I've got this fantastic umbrella plant here. When they're starting to seed, I just cut the sticks like this, and then I take them indoors, and then I've got a vase of umbrella plant flowers, and they just keep coming. The other really big tip I've got, fold up furniture. So my chairs fold up, which means that I can move them around easily because manoeuvring in the space is a bit difficult. But my ultimate tip to make it more of a flexible space is to get a disco mirror ball, because I've had so much pleasure, and during lockdown when I was just here on my own and this was my only outdoor space, I'd turn my tunes on and have my mirror ball going.
I really like Dina's garden, and clearly it gives her a huge amount of pleasure. And of course, every garden should have a disco ball. Actually, you'd be surprised to learn that we have a disco ball up in the hallway in the house. Occasionally, the lights flash and the music plays. Anyway, moving on swiftly at the thought of that.
Still to come on today's programme, I celebrate some of the successes in the vegetable garden.
There is something really grand and almost heroic about a good cabbage.
And we visit Joel Bird in Kent, who grows his vegetables on the roof of his shed.
There's about 15 square metres of growing space, but within that 15 square metres, I'm growing a lot of stuff.
But first, we have a film from sisters who have found that over the last few months, their relative lack of knowledge about gardening has become an all-consuming passion. And not just for them either, but also to satisfy the very particular requirements of their pets.
My name is Kirsty.
My name is Rebecca. And my name is Mandy, and we live in Poole in Dorset. Since the lockdown, we have taken to a bit of gardening.
I love gardening. It's my favourite kind of thing, my hobby. Lovely, love flowers.
And now, it's going money.
On your bike. Gardening is new for us. Kirsty and Rebecca are usually out at pottery. craft classes or practicing their beloved Elvis and Michael Jackson impersonations. But in March, we were suddenly at home with time on our hands and worried about how to get our pet tortoises enough fresh lettuce. We decided to begin with just to paint up some old terracotta pots. We put them in the garden and we also posted them online just to show people what we were doing. We were overwhelmed by the response, so we cleaned out the greenhouse and we found some old seeds and some old compost and planted some stuff up.
Wavy, wavy.
Becky has been an able assistant in between practicing her dance routines. Does that moonwalk?
Yeah.
But Kirsty has definitely been bitten by the gardening bug.
It's so plus, it's so big, it's so amazing. It's growing. Tomato plants and basil and chilies. It grows so quick.
We've now got trays of fresh lettuce, so the tortoises help themselves to some while the others regrow. And we discovered it wasn't just our tortoises who liked our gardening. Everybody started to really enjoy our little videos. So we realised that not only were they cheering us up, but we were cheering up all those other people that were also logged in and following us on social media. And having watched Monty plant out his runner beans, we knew exactly what to do with ours. What are you doing?
The planting runner beans for a garden field.
Perfect.
Okay. This is runner bean. And you're gonna grow in that soil. And dig a hole first. Well, hold in runner bean. Cover it in soil, keep it warm. And like that. And so thank you, it goes field.
We've been planting everything out since the lettuces and beans, with Kirsty's watchful eye. The sunflowers have needed staking, and hot sunshine has meant lots of watering for thirsty plants. Brilliant.
Thanks.
But thanks to Monty, Kirsty knows not everything needs a daily soaking.
I can't water it.
How do you know that?
Because my John told me I can't water it and I just let it dry. I got more chilies, dangling bits.
We've had such a lovely time together growing so many plants. Ta-da!
Ta-da!
And we've learned so much along the way. Asta?
Asta like a shot?
Not Asda, Asta. There's been so much support from our community. It's been amazing. But as animal lovers,
They got seeds.
Seeds?
Fish seeds.
we are still missing some friends on a Friday night. So finally, we just wanted to say to Nigel in the sky, say hello to all our dogs that have flown up there on high. We will miss you on the TV, the world will miss you too. And Monty, you're a diamond, and we send all our love to you.
Yeah.
Cheers!
Cheers to Nigel.
Cheers to Nigel.
Nigel.
Cheers.
Cheers.
And why do you love gardening?
I love it.
You just love it.
Yeah.
Because it makes you smile, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you for your lovely poem, Kirsty and Rebecca. I thought your garden looked terrific, and I was very moved by your reference to Nigel, who, of course, I'm still missing like mad. But I have got topiary Nigel, and we need to look after him. He's getting a bit shaggy, as he was in life. And you can see that also, on the back here, Nigel's got some brown bits, and that's where the frost hit it in the middle of May. The sun came up, it was really hot, and burnt the frosted parts. But where the sun didn't hit, lower down, he's fine. He's still looking good. But if you've got brown bits on your yew hedge or on topiary, don't worry. It's not dying. It's just likely to be an effect of frost. But I think he's due for a little trim now, just to get him into shape. And you can trim topiary now and keep it looking crisp, but you'll probably have to do it again in September. But for a small bit of topiary, that's not much of a price to pay. Whereas if you wait till August and then cut topiary or yew hedges, then it should stay really crisp right through to the next May. But just clip away and let's make you look really smart, Nige.
I have to say, I'm getting so much pleasure from all the films that you're sending in. And here's one from a wonderful front garden in London.
Hi, my name's Alicia and welcome to our garden. We have a small garden on a road, so we have to think of imaginative ways to make it intimate, relaxing and versatile. And one way we do that is by using pots. This is a pot I made a few weeks ago. I used some marigold seeds that I harvested from last year, and they've come up beautifully, along with some calendula and some lobelia so that can trail over the side. This centerpiece is this really stunning silver dust that I got when it was this small. What's lovely about silver dust, especially in my region, is that it's evergreen. So this pot will continue through winter and will give me some really beautiful color and structure. So one of the most relaxing things to add to your garden is a water feature. And what we've done is we found a pot, we added some water, and we got some really beautiful stones from a local gardener. We added the stones after cleaning them with a toothbrush and purchased one of these. Now this is a solar powered fountain that you can get from any online retailer. Pop it in the water, and with a little bit of sun, you have a fountain. So if you only have a front garden for your outdoor space, why not try to be inventive and create something really special for you to spend your time in, even if it's beside a road?
Perhaps the greatest pleasure that I get from the garden in winter is not from the plants, but from feeding the birds. And I never tire of watching them.
I feed the birds on top of walls, on stones, on the table, to try and have a lot of different locations so different birds can use them. And to that end, what birds love are seeds, nuts, and fats. Now, I start with the single best thing that you can ever feed birds, which are sunflower seeds. They come in two forms. You have them when the husks are taken off, and quite a few birds prefer these. Blackbirds, for example, will always go straight for these. And then you can get them unhulled, and some birds like the process of taking the hulls off, and their beaks are specially adapted to do that. Of course, if you're growing sunflowers in the garden, don't cut them back, but leave them for the birds to extract every last seed. And I sprinkle them on the log. What I want to do is make it hard for some birds to get at it and make sure the little ones, like the robins, can get their sharper beaks into the crevices. I also have stones, which I put on the table, which again just provides variety. The other seed which I always use are Niger seeds. These are absolutely tiny, little black seeds that are ideal for finches. Goldfinches, for example, love them. You'll see them in the garden feeding off thistle heads, and just sprinkle those on. It's just like creating a dish. And then on top of that, you can buy some of the dried mealworms, which you'll find blackbirds and robins absolutely adore, and the starlings will come in and eat these as well. So we've got a little bit of protein there for them. And a favorite are peanuts. You can fill a wire hopper like this and hang it up. And this will attract not just tits, but also we get the great spotted woodpecker. And it's important to make birds feel safe. So don't put it out in the open. If you can put it under the shade of a tree or a shrub, and what we find is the birds like it if you hang these up on a wall. And that also keeps them out of the way of rats and squirrels too. You can also feed fats. Fats are very high in calories, and that's really important. You can provide fats in slabs and these cages, which you hang up, and we find that the long-tailed tits, which arrive in great family groups of up to a dozen birds, will feed greedily, and then there'll be a noise, and the whole thing, like a puff of smoke, will disappear. I love watching them. So you hang that up, or you can use fat balls, and you can get special containers for fat balls. You just pop them in, and you can either stand them on a table or hang them up. Finally, don't forget to have fresh water. It's really important that there is a water supply all the time, and birds will use this not just to drink, but also they will use it to wash. And if it's frozen, really important to make sure the ice is broken and there is a supply of water even in the hardest frost. And as well as the reward that you get from sharing your space with birds, there is a huge benefit to the garden, because the more birds you have in the garden, the fewer caterpillars and aphids and slugs and snails you will have. And birds are one of the linchpins of a really healthy garden.
Last year, we were unable to visit as many gardens as we would have liked. However, we did get the chance to explore the garden of Jackie and Pete Ager. So take a moment now to enjoy the simple sights and sounds of their garden in Worcester.
I do think that we all get so busy with the process of horticulture that sometimes we forget just to stop. Now, I've been busy in here, actually. This is very much part of the engine room of Longmeadow, and at this time of year, where I grow cucumbers and gherkins. So I grow them in pots which are half full of garden compost, and then bring them in here where it's not only hot, it's fairly moist too, and I water them very thoroughly. And you can see they're growing very well indeed. This is a variety called Burpless Tasty Green, and we've already got quite a few on here. I'm often asked how you know when a cucumber is ready for harvesting. Well, as good a guide as any is to look at the end. You can see if you've got a small one like this, it's got a much more pointed end to it, compared to this one here, which is much more rounded. This is absolutely ready, and I will certainly harvest that today.
As the season progressed, there were a growing number of delicious harvests to be made in the vegetable garden.
These are classic runner beans, Scarlet Emperor, and if you pick them at least once a week, that will encourage them to produce new beans and keep going. And They are really trustworthy and hardy and absolutely delicious.
The Three Sisters planting turned out well.
The sweet corn have been exceptionally good this year. And you can tell when they're ripe because the tassels at the end turn brown and fall.
And though I say it myself, some of my brassicas were superb.
Look at that. The whole plant is magnificent. There is something really grand and almost heroic about a good cabbage. So that can go in there.
And I was amazed and delighted
Whoa!
by the number of spuds I got from just 2 pink fir apple potatoes that I planted in June.
How about that? Just from one bag. I think that's what you call a good job.
Now, we're heading to Kent to meet Joel Bird. He also loves to grow veg, and last year he took this passion to new heights.
I think of myself as a bit of a veg shed man. I spend more time in that garden space than I do in the house. Sometimes I wonder why I've got a house. I'm Joel Bird. This is my garden, which is in Margate. I live here with my family, 2 small children. And I designed the garden to try and accommodate all of our needs. One of the main things is to try and grow crops, but since it was so small, I decided to lift the footprint of the shed, which is my studio, put the allotment on top of the roof. The shed is something that I built, it's bespoke, so I designed it with the roof in mind. I bought the structure because you have to make sure that the thickness of these roof joists is strong enough to take the soil, so that's quite important. But the rest of it, recycled wood, like for example, the staircase was going to go into a skip. There was a shed here originally, so I ripped that shed down and I used that cladding to clad the insides of the shed. That's just the way I live. I've always lived like that, you know, trying to just pick things up and put them into builds. This is where I grow all kinds of fruit and vegetables. There's about 15 square meters of growing space, but within that 15 square meters, I'm growing a lot of stuff. We don't have any fences up here, but we're careful about not going too close to the edge. And the raised beds act as a kind of barrier. I think of the garden as a garden in the sky, really. It's a very, very hot space, especially on a day like today. It's getting the sun constantly, but that's a good thing in terms of the veg. It's quite exposed up here. You've got a gap between the houses, and you get a lot of wind coming through that gap, especially because it's a coastal town. So that's one of the problems, but I've put a bank of grasses at the front, miscanthus, bamboo, and the old Stipa giganta. The idea is that's going to break up the wind. So today I'm going to do a little bit of harvesting like I always do. These potatoes here will be going straight into the pot later. When I first planted the potatoes, the original idea was that I wanted to grow my own scouse. Scouse is a Liverpool stew, really. Actually, scouses are named after the food scouse. So I always put my potatoes in my scouse. It's part of our life. Everyone in Liverpool eats scouse when they're growing up. It's quite important for me personally to try and be, you know, as self-sufficient as I can. It's part of my life, really. I've always been an artist, a musician, things like that. So it was always about trying to save money and live frugally. It keeps our shopping bill down. We've got some cucumbers here. Actually, they've done really well. It was a bit of an experiment, really. They struggled at first because they grew quite high, but we had some strong winds come in, 40, 50 mile an hour. and the leaves took a bit of a battering. But I've put some grasses to try and protect them, and I've found if I can just get them off the ground but keep them at a lower level, then they came back to life and they've done really well. The fennel here creates a little bit of height, and this handles the winds pretty well, you know, because it will sway in the wind. So this is the herb garden. I've got mint. This is yarrow. So I often use the mint and yarrow to make a mint and yarrow tea. We've got thyme, sage and oregano. You see the scabious just popping out here. I always have flowers interspersed between the herbs. I try to create a bit of a highway for the bees to travel through the whole garden, really. And so along the way, they're going to be pollinating. This is a great place for the herbs. They like free drainage. They like to be out in the open. I put the herbs at this end of the roof because this is the driest part of the roof, because the gradient takes the water to the front, and I know they can handle it. I have the irrigation system, and that filters through into a gutter and then it eventually ends up in the fish pond. Really, I'm just trying to not waste water. Part of the joy of gardening to me is definitely the nature. I could probably be more prolific if I waged war on the snails and the aphids, but I'm not interested in that. I like to see the butterflies laying their eggs on the crops, that's fine. So it's always been part of the philosophy for me is not to have a perfect garden. The family obviously loved the garden. It became apparent in the lockdown that this space just became so valuable to us. And I found that we instinctively congregated around the shed, around that garden space. We found in the end that we were spending all day out here. I think people sometimes just forget that they can have a garden anywhere. If you can grow plants in pots, then you can use any space to have a garden. And my rooftop is one of those examples. I often go on the what I call the deadhead stroll, where those few hours at the end of the day is a nice, peaceful time for me. I'm quite lucky because the sun goes down in the gap between the houses and I can watch the sunset over the sea.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this week. But Gardener's World will be back with a brand new series in March. So until